Hey,
Hello, hello.
Hey guys, how's it going?
Pretty good.
I'm uh I'm halfway through a 600 question RFP. So that's my day.
Yeah,
hello.
I know that
Yeah, this
haven't you
one's
can't haven't just thrown it into ChatGPT with all your previous
like
responses and got it to respond for you yet?
yeah, it's tempting. This one's like over the line in terms of its egregiousness for sure. I thought that's what SOC 2 and ISO was meant to,
Yeah, you think so. Yeah, we just did our SOC 2 Type 1 stuff at the end of last year, which was a lot of yeah, that was not easy.
Hey everyone. Sorry,
hey,
my camera's off.
Hey.
I guess we'll wait a few more minutes. Not too many people here yet.
is it is anyone going to I guess you're going to KubeCon Paris, right, Thomas?
Yeah, yeah, I'm going to. Um, from Germany, it's not too far. Actually, we are
Yeah,
doing
but
some
we'll have a
contrib.
booth there as well.
Nice.
You're getting a
Yeah,
booth.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah,
Yeah, we
no.
had one in Chicago.
actually, Todd, Lucas, and me, we're gonna have like the contrib fest for OpenFeature. So if you want to code with us, you're welcome. If you want to start contributing. Mhm.
Okay, I guess we can get started. Not quite as many people today. And I don't know how many of you saw the React demo. I think it was most. So maybe I won't do the whole thing again, but I really wanted to quickly kick it off with a bit of new functionality in the React demo. Because it has implications on some spec stuff. So I'll share my screen. And a second. Okay, so last week I demoed a few things with the React SDK. And the one I ended on was this. So this is this context change demo. So the idea here is that this little button just mutates something in the context that just basically inverts a single property. And of course, when that happens, especially on the client side, this means that we might need to do a bulk flag reevaluation. A lot of providers kind of work that way, where the user property has changed, something with the logged in user or the application or application state in general has changed, and so we need to reevaluate flags. So I think it was Andreas from Spotify kind of asked last week, well, what if this takes time, right? So in this demo, this is basically a synchronous thing. We're using the in-memory provider, so when we change the context, we basically immediately know. that we're ready to reevaluate, and we can do that. So I did a little POC that essentially uses some existing SDK functionality, namely stale events, to kind of demo, well, what if there's some hang time here? So you can go to the same demo and you can do a delay. So I can do a delay of 1 second, 1000 ms here. And if I hit this, you'll see that I get the same exact effect, except there's a suspense, a React suspense that takes place in the middle. So basically, this is an artificial hang time in my provider to reevaluate the flag. So this would correspond to like hitting a server, evaluating with the new context, then getting flag values back. So I think this is a nice experience. It works well, as you can see. And with React, you have you kind of get this for free. So any components that are impacted by this asynchronous operation, they're all going to suspend. That's what you're seeing happen here when that context is changed. So the reason that I really want to bring this up, and that this, I don't think this can really be considered done at this point, is because with the addition of React, the React SDK, I think it's led to a lot of it's led to the realization, at least from my end, and I think a few people agree, that the semantics around our events aren't quite as tight as they should be, and maybe we're missing a few events, or at least missing some semantics on events we already have. Specifically, I don't think stale is necessarily the right event for this, or the right state and event for this. So I think when stale was initially introduced, it was something that Pete was really interested in. It was more like, we're disconnected from the source of truth. Our cache is stale, not we're doing something very specific in that we're reevaluating our flags because context has changed. So that's something that only impacts the client, but there's a spec discussion open now, which I will add to the notes in a second here, that basically is talking about maybe like improving the semantics around events and adding a few more events potentially, or at least one event potentially, to especially client SDKs to represent this like context pending state, as well as simplify the SDK in general, by kind of abstracting the provider state away from end users a little bit more. So there's really good discussion there. Like I said, I'll put it in the notes, but I'd love to get more people looking at it, because I think this is an important thing to nail down. I don't know if anybody has any questions or feedback at this point, but I'll open up if you do.
So does this make use of, or is this then making multiple, is the client now making multiple requests back to the provider for all of the flags that it needs to update or not?
Yeah, so basically in the client, we already have this in the client context, we already have this concept of on context change. So your provider has a handler, where you optionally detect that the context has been changed, and then you can do a reconciliation action, which typically is going to be asynchronous. So that's what's happening here. Essentially, we're using the existing events. Like there's no new eventing or anything going on here. We're just using the existing events API, and building React components on top of it, like a React provider on top of it, that is just hooking into those. So basically, this new state it just adds a stale event handler, waits for the provider to go stale, and then suspends while the provider is stale until the on context change is complete, which is another event. So it's just listen for stale, suspend, listen for context change, unsuspend. Which again works fine. I just think that we're probably overloading stale. At least that's what I'm starting to think, and other people have expressed the same thing.
So I know that some of the folks over here at Spotify has been looking at this. I don't have any sort of opinions just yet. I haven't had time to look through the discussion. But what I was thinking about is like, do you have any ideas around like, okay, so when this context change happens, like that is basically saying that the data that we have in the provider or in the SDK, that is no longer valid, right? Because something has changed in the context that makes that data like useless, right? So do we like, and if someone then asks for a flag during the time that we are sort of like in this stale state, do we like, is the spec then saying that we should be returning default values at that point?
Yeah, I don't, the spec I don't think specifies what happens there. I think that the implied behavior is you would return reason stale, because stale is a reason. But I think that's where we're lacking semantics. So the whole on context changed thing, the whole this whole like basically this whole idea that okay, there's a context change, your provider reacts to it, but the flags are in this, you know, I guess like unsettled state for some hang time. That's not, it's just not rigorously defined. The semantics around it are not rigorously defined. So I'm using stale here. And I think this is what Andreas brought up last week. It's probably not exactly what the original intent for stale was. So I would say this is more of a POC grade solution at this point. At the very least, we have to really refine the semantics around stale and say this is an acceptable use case for it. But I'm starting to think that's not the right path forward. The other thing would be to define some additional events and semantics specifically for this scenario, which I think is probably not a bad idea. Wouldn't be hugely complicated, but it could include an answer to the question you're asking. You know, this is a very specific thing with React where you have suspense. So no flag evaluations take place if you're using this feature, but that's not always going to be the case. So then, as to your point, we're going to need to probably define what happens if there is a flag evaluation in that state, which again we haven't done.
Yeah, cool.
How we've handled this in the past is like adding, at least for the client side, adding like on update handlers that you can. I know you like to handle a lot of these in like your global events emitter and things like that, but adding like specific on update handlers to variables or to flags so that if somebody wants, like in that case where they get a stale value and an updated value comes in later and they want to action on it, they can use those semantics. But in React, it's a little simpler because you can sort of just re-render and update the flags when the updated flags come in. But for other sort of client side situations, yeah, sometimes you need further handlers and things like that to provide the updated values to the interface.
Andreas?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember, but because we looked, and I think specifically in the React case, we don't want to, because like there you have the defer hook that is connected. It's compatible with suspense. So you use the defer hook to, like if you want to keep the stale values, you should wrap the flag value in defer, and that will then work automatically. But yeah, and otherwise you will show directly a loader screen.
Yeah, I think the question of the semantics on returning a value during this period is probably less interesting in React and more interesting in other situations, because I think, like, you know, to Jonathan's point, I think in React, with the fact that everything is re-rendered and you have these dependencies, and as soon as the flags change, you know, you get an updated value, plus the fact you have suspense. It's opinionated enough that maybe the answer to some of these questions is fairly obvious, but I think that generally we need better semantics just in the web SDK outside of something as specific as React. just in terms of how that stuff works.
Yeah, I would claim you gotta be a little careful with suspense, because I think that's something you only really want to use on the initial load. Like if you sort of like you don't have any values, use suspense for the initial load, and then you get a set of flag values, and then the user context changes again, and you're fetching another set of like updated values. I'm not sure you want to go into that suspense state between like the initial load and like the context change, right? Like I think you want to use the stale values for that period and then update to the new values, because generally you want to avoid the interface changing that frequently, because you're kind of inserting another kind of flash or interface change to the user between sort of like a valid set of values and your next valid set of values.
Yeah, I think that's generally true. I would say that I have one very specific use case in mind. There is internally some feature flags that essentially user control is exposed to, so they can basically manually mutate their context to opt into a flag, and when that happens, we expect the UI to repaint, and so then the user does too. So there's some loaders and spinners, but that may be an edge case. In the current POC I have here open, which I'll also link. This is an option you have to explicitly opt into with the React SDK. So it won't suspend like this on context. Change by default.
Yeah.
I think generally that's right.
I just want to add to that. So that's what I was alluding to, because I think the right way is to actually suspend, because React has already the defer mechanism to like opt out of that and keep the current state values until the suspense resolves.
Right, that's
so
true.
I think
too.
Instead of adding more the idiomatic way to do that in React. I mean, I'm no React expert, but that's how the defer hook is used, as I understand. So I don't think we need that as an option in the React integration.
Yeah, that could be. I mean, yeah, maybe that's something we can discuss further in the PR, but I think that's an interesting point.
Yep.
Yeah, so I will quickly add a couple links under my point here, and then I'll move into a scribe role for the rest of the time we have, unless there's any more questions or points or anything anyone would like to bring up about this specific issue. I'll link the PR I'm talking about. I'll link the spec issue I'm talking about that discusses some of these things. I think that's all I have. Okay, thanks. That brings us to Lucas. Like I said, I'll try and keep notes as we go on.
Okay, yeah, so I just have three smaller things. So for the Nest.js SDK, we are kind of at a point where we would, as I said last time, would like to go into the direction of the first non-experimental release. And there's one main thing blocking this, because currently from the React SDK, from the not React SDK, from the Web SDK, we are exporting something that is called OpenFeature client, which is the implementation of the client interface that is used internally, which is instantiated by the API. And we have like a decorator to inject clients, which is currently called feature client, to not clash with that. And we just decided that this OpenFeature client class, should not be exported from the Web SDK at all, because people like end users of the SDK shouldn't be using that or shouldn't be instantiating it. They should get it from the API. So this is something that we put into a list of stuff that we want to change in a 2.0 release for the Web SDK, for the server SDK, because there are like several things that could be in there, just small renaming and so. And yes, this would be something that we would like to do before we release the first non-experimental Nest version, just because otherwise we would have to change it afterwards. Yeah, and I don't know, Jonathan, you said you may have the time to have a look and try the Nest SDK. If that's something that you're still willing to, that would be great. Otherwise, yeah, we are just waiting for that, and afterwards we would try to get some feedback if people come and give feedback. Otherwise, we would transition into the first non-experimental when we have that thing done.
Oh, yeah, I started to poke around with it, and then I got distracted with all the React typing errors that I found this week. So
Yeah, no problem.
take another. It's all right.
Yeah, okay. The next thing would be the context propagation spec change. I think we have 3 approvals now. If people are interested in the context propagation, or if you have opinions on that, would be great to leave feedback now. Otherwise, after the meeting, we would write a message that we would, I don't know, not actually sure when, but for example, in a week or in some days, that we would merge it then if there's no obligations or opinions that are blocking this. That's it. So if you're interested, have a look and leave feedback. Exactly. The last thing was an issue that was opened in the spec some days ago, 4 days ago, by someone who was asking for something like best practices, patterns, architecture styles that like enable feature flagging. That it was like kind of, otherwise we would have ifs over like everywhere in our code, and we were just thinking maybe we could work on something like best practices, patterns, or something that we could write a blog post about, or that we could put into our docs, just to help people get into feature flagging without like having ifs at every layer and like distributed around their whole code base. So if someone is interested in working on something like this, have a look. We could open up some issues here, and we could see like how we would really bring this to people to help them like structure their projects with feature flagging. That was the last thing.
Yeah, I think we might have some content around that. I'm sure Ben probably does too. But yeah, I can probably get our DevRel folks trying to help with that as well.
Yeah, that would be really cool, because we thought that would be quite nice if people that are interested in feature flagging also find help here to like see, okay, which patterns, which architecture styles or whatever are really good for feature flagging. So to also provide this as a project.
It's tricky as well, because really, if someone's coming and asking those questions, they first need to learn about non-open. They need to learn about flags first without OpenFeature, because that just complicates things as a concept. We found that like, it's, you can kind of never dumb it down enough almost for this sort of stuff.
Maybe it could also be
the wrong word, but you kind of know what I mean. You want to start from the absolute basics.
Yeah, maybe we could also go with
this is more
like this.
They're asking more about like design patterns, like how do you, and that's where like the Next SDK, or like how the React SDK is set up. It's like it's built into the mechanics of those languages, right? Versus a lot of the server-side implementations are more just like throw an if here, or you can maybe write a middleware that interacts with your router, right? But yeah, most I would say, I think it sounds like he's asking more for those types of like design patterns.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, that's interesting as well, because it's, you know, the project as a whole has an opportunity to do like quite deep framework specific work, which, like, you know, like someone like Flagsmith, we just don't have the bandwidth to do that and maintain it across, you know, like 6 different frameworks or whatever. So that's fair enough. But I think both things need addressing, right, as well, in terms of things.
Maybe these could also be 2 things that go pretty well together, like that we have something like feature flagging 101s, really getting into it, like getting to the root of the problem first, and then like going nearer to implementations, and maybe even having some reference implementations where we have pros and cons or something like this. It could be like anything, and it could be on the blog, it could be on the documentations, maybe both. Just getting some stuff out to help people there.
Yeah,
I mean, the stuff that you, sorry, go ahead, Thomas.
Yeah, I was saying like
I know like in my company, like when you talk about feature flagging, people are like imagining like thousands of different things, like config files for builds are seen as feature flagging. So I think just being sure that you put the right glossary and the right name on what is also something we can bring on, because most of developers are not used to it. So I think it could be a blog post too.
Yeah, I mean that's true. The other thing that comes to mind is like one of the real goals of this project is exactly to simplify the stuff that Ben is mentioning, right? Like that one of the whole ideas is that ideally OpenFeature enables the creation of integrations which can support multiple providers, multiple backend systems, flag management platforms, and without having to manage a ton of code. Because things like the React SDK that I've been working on, and I wouldn't say I'm a React expert at all either. It requires a lot of knowledge of the frameworks, but it's not really that much to write. Like the React SDK is a couple hundred lines of code just built on top of the web SDK, right? And so I think really where we can shine and help out a little bit is to get people who have deep knowledge of particular frameworks to write an integration that's going to be very idiomatic, something like Nest, something like Spring, something like React, something like Angular, and essentially like give a high quality integration that's compatible with a whole bunch of backends, right? Like that's basically one of our raison d'etres in the project. So it's something we should highlight for sure. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything else we wanted to talk about on that topic, Lucas, but maybe if anybody, we can bring that back around to later if anybody has ideas for blog posts or creating issues or anything like that, or specific integrations. It's something we can talk about, revisit. Okay,
Just
there's no
finally,
more.
sorry, I mean, just to add to that, just finally, like, it's a super like powerful use case for OpenFeature of like, we've done all the abstraction. You can just plug into our React specific stuff, and then like, look, you can change provider with one line, which typically when you're dealing with like more complex front end frameworks, like that can be really, really painful if you want to change provider or provide some like test endpoints or stuff like that. Like it can be super painful. So it's definitely like, people would go like, oh, okay, now that's another big benefit as well, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, true. Okay. With that, I guess we can move on. Jonathan, you had an additional point?
Yeah, I know there's some interest previously in what a Next.js SDK for OpenFeature would look like, and wanted to cover. We've just been through a bit of a marathon, and I'll share quickly some details that that we went through. For those who don't know, like Next.js is very much trying to get you in the habit of actually doing server rendered code for your front end, and we went through the process of supporting their new app router, which, yeah, I would advise, is like, from talking with the community, it's pretty rough right now. Like I'd almost not recommend using App Router fully in production for a large scale app yet. It's pretty rough, but the theory is that you could, like, every component you have by default, it's actually a server rendered component, and you have to explicitly sort of like call out certain client side components. So it really is mixing sort of server state and client state together. And I won't get into all the details here. I can post these for you all to read later, but the real challenge is sharing the context between the client side and server side. And in our case, we went with an architecture where like the server side sort of owns the context and is responsible for like updating the client-side code and making sure the client-side code like has the right context. So even if you update the user context on the client side, that actually triggers an action to the server side to sort of fetch new flag values, update the state, and re-render that to the client side. And that's where a lot of the complications of this comes in. We went through a couple different ways of like how to properly actually like structure and wrap our SDK so that both the server side and client side can share state, and eventually have got it to work. But it was it was quite a journey. We also support like streaming and suspense boundaries. So how Next.js does like suspense is that like it'll suspend on the client side and then it'll actually stream from the server side like a chunk of code that'll get evaled on on the client side to like to sort of unsuspend a component. So it's sort of streaming updated components from your server side to the client side, and you can imagine that gets pretty complicated when you're trying to flag both server-side components and client-side components at the same time. So yeah, I'll post all these to the doc, but take a read through. Hopefully this can help us inform a little bit of the things that we need to do to set up an Next.js sort of SDK for OpenFeature. The gist of it is basically you're going to need it you're going to have to like heavily modify your client side sort of React SDK to be driven by sort of the server side component, and get, you can probably copy how we've done it, but like get the server side sort of controlling the front end state and making sure that in all these different scenarios of how things can be re-rendered, how the server can send server components to the client side, that that's driven from sort of one shared state. So happy to go into that in detail in the future, but yeah, there's lots of unique challenges to it that make it conceptually pretty different than I think a lot of the other SDKs that we built.
Very interesting. I have two questions related to that. So, first is kind of a stupid one. I guess you could, in any case, correct me if I'm wrong, I guess you could in any case use a client provider and a server provider in Next.js. It's just that if you did that, if you use two different providers, then those components would be inherently locked to one or the other framework, right? So you wouldn't be able to move a component from server to client transparently, which am I correct to understand that's kind of the primary goal of your SDK, is that it's essentially transparent whether or not it's operating on the client or server for users or for authors?
Yeah, basically it should be a similar, basically the same interface. And I can sort of show the other blog post where we sort of show how it's initialized. But yeah, so a server component, just using get variable values, and then it's just use variable value, which is sort of the same React style interface on the client side. So there's a bit of a difference. The server side still being asynchronous, and the client side can be synchronous because the client side is always going to be rendered with a state from the server side. But yeah. Also, I'm not like, I helped with this, but I wasn't the driving force behind it. So I can get Adam to join at some point and go through some of the details. But yeah, you basically so app router and pages router have different implementations. And one of the tricks here is you kind of have to set up a separate file, like a server rendered file that you initialize the SDK with, and then that gets imported from your root file. When we tried to have this we tried to do this all sort of like in one page, Next.js has some bugs where it wasn't properly, and the complicated thing about Next.js is that it has a custom basically compiler, right? So it's it's figuring out which parts of your code it needs to keep in the server-side code and which parts that need to go to the client side, right? And so we found actually a couple of core bugs where it was taking some of our third-party server-side only code and actually shipping it to the client side, which actually caused like a security incident for Next.js and stuff like that. So yeah, so that's where a lot of the complexities get in, that you're actually like dealing with the Next.js's compiler to figure out which code should be server side and which stuff should be client side, and how it deals with that. And then yeah, the pages routing is a bit different.
That's really interesting. My second question is, and maybe this is a hard question to answer right now. Do you get the impression that if we wanted to give first class support for Next.js in OpenFeature, would it be a situation where we use the Node SDK in the server and the client SDK in the client, and the complexity would all be in the provider to kind of bridge the gap there, or would we need basically a dedicated SDK? Do you have any?
Yeah, I think it's confusing. I think you actually kind of need to use the client side SDK and the server side, if that makes any sense. It's kind of what we ended up doing is we use our client side SDK interface on the server side, still using like local evaluation. So all of our evaluation is still being done like locally in your Next.js server, but it's using the interface of the client side SDK, if that makes sense.
Interesting.
So maybe V1 of this is just like, it's basically using the client side SDK and making those remote evaluations mainly as a V1, but we probably would want to provide an interface so that people who have server SDKs that can respond in that format could do the local evaluation.
Andreas?
Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah. No, I was just saying, yeah, I'm excited to check out this material. We've been trying this out a bit as well. And there we tried, I mean, where we were trying to go is using the client, like the web SDK client side, that to us made the most sense, but that's very difficult with the singleton approach, and how you set context, etc. But yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. It might be a thing where we need some API that looks like the client but doesn't have the same singleton behavior and that sort of thing. But yeah, would functionally look a little bit more like the client SDK in terms of the API service. Interesting, very interesting. Yeah, I'm super excited to read that, Jonathan. Thanks.
Yeah, just to add, like the Flagsmith Next.js is the same as yours, Jonathan. It's the client side one with stuff sprinkled on top. Yeah, always JavaScript, man. Who thought that was a good idea?
Okay. Very cool. I'll try and add some. This is a really good conversation. I'll try and add some additional documentation to the agenda that I missed as we were going through. But I think that's it, unless anybody has anything to add. Thanks everybody for coming today. Really interesting discussion.
Thank you.
Any other points?
Right.
Cool. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thanks. See you.
Thank you. Bye.